Well, Ellie, welcome to our advanced analytics profiling exceptional CEO leaders that are, driving AI solutions into the marketplace. And I thought we could begin today, Ellie, if you could just describe what is MindBridge all about? What business case are you solving? And, do you have a position in your offering in terms of being responsible in terms of AI, so ensure it's explainable? Obviously, a lot of the industry is quite concerned to ensure that people understand what's in the secret sauce. So let's start there for today.
Cindy, it's really a pleasure to be on your show, especially with somebody as experienced and as giving as you are to Canada and the industry for many, many years. So in terms of MindBridge, we really developed product. And from day one, we decided it is a product as opposed to a consulting to address one key problem. And the key problem is to find the anomalies in financial data. If you look at the industry right now, the GDP of the world pre-COVID was $85 trillion. If you listen to or read the report from the ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, they will identify that $4.5 trillion a year get lost to evaporate from the GDP due to mismanagement. As a matter of fact, about November of last year, 2019, there was a study by one of the major financial companies, and they identified, they pulled 1,100 CFOs and different CEOs, and they identified that only 34%, 1 in 3 CFOs, feel comfortable with the data that they are signing off. What we are trying to do, call it the MRI of data. We look at financial data and identify anomalies and risk in the data. And our ambition is to basically make and restore trust in the financial data. So when people make a decision, they know that they are making a decision based on sound principles.
So what are some of the use cases, when you think about it, 1 in 3 are not confident and they're signing off on financials in publicly traded companies. I'm assuming most of the research there is public. So what, as a result, are the use cases that you're focusing on? I know you're doing a fair bit in fraudulent detection and credit scoring, but what are the use cases that you're driving home to sort of close the gap?
So the first use case that we decided, and it's important again to note that when you look at the AI companies, you have 3 ways that you really can go about it. You can become a consulting organization where you look for a problem and then try to solve it, or many problems. Secondly, you can become a platform where you're going to provide your solution to a third party that can utilize your solution to solve a problem. And then you have the third one, which is MindBridge, and companies like ours, which is the minority, where we are trying to identify a problem and solve it. So in the case of our use cases, we decided that the big problem is the CFO office. They are the one that are them and the controller in governments are the one that actually are the custodian of the data, the financial data of this $85 trillion that all consist of financial transactions. But when we started to look at it 5 years ago, we realized that in order to train our AI models, we needed access to data. And in order to go one by one to an institution and ask for the financial data, it's going to take us a long time to get access to this financial data. And as you know, many people are very reluctant for justifiably, for many reasons, for privacy and other reasons, not to depart from the data. Then we decided, so how do you get access to this data? So the use case that we went after was, let's go and look at who else has access to this data. And it was very clear that external auditors have access to the same data, but when you look at it, they don't look at it in terms of one at a time, but rather than using a spoon, you can use a shovel, because they have a lot of, they do basically audits for a lot of companies. And lo and behold, 4 years later, we launched the product about 3.5 years ago. So let's say about 4 years later, we process over 7,000 different individual enterprises data, and that gives us over 13 trillion data points, that information about the different markets and what's going on with it. So the use case that we're looking is obviously try to find anomalies in financial data, and that's the first use case that we're looking. That will lead to risk, that will lead to obviously internal audit to look at any fraud and things of this nature. But the use cases associated with the technology are much wider than these. We chose not to go into more than financial data at this point in time, although we have done work and on purpose. We try to stay very close to the knitting and just focus on the financial data, but we could easily go into other markets.
So is that data primarily, sort of all the transactions, all the financial data that leads to an income statement, for a company and a balance sheet? So it's kind of like all of the transactions, identifying anomalies of risk, and surfacing it mainly to auditors. Is that the direction?
That's the first use case that we looked after, and we've been very successful with that. We have hundreds of companies around the globe that are using it, and they use it as a tool to help them to basically do a better job. This is a tool that our whole premise is that AI is horizontal technology to augment the knowledge of the individual, not to replace the individual. So it's really important from our perspective that we are giving the tool to accelerate and augment the capabilities of the individual.
Yeah, it's almost forensic AI just because of the volume of processing, so that then the validation and the acceptance, the final review is by the human, but you're speeding up the anomaly detection with the processing and AI algorithms. And wow, that's a really cool use case, Eli. What, as you are into the organizations, obviously, we've talked about the sensitivity of privacy and access to data. Obviously, going in through the auditors, which are in the review, you're really a complementary enabler to their service offering. So you've really mitigated that, barrier to entry. What are you seeing in terms of, your perspectives on new governance roles for CEOs or board directors? Obviously, the recent report that just came out from IDC that I was just reading is highlighting that the acceleration of AI across all business practices is even greater than they had assumed 4 years ago. Do you think we're moving fast enough to put in, the right experts in the organizations as you kind of look through your different client accounts, or are things still mainly within the IT enablement areas of oversight?
Unfortunately, we are not moving fast enough, and I want to elaborate. It's really important to note that when we look at our data, as a company, we don't have access to the internal data. The auditors that are familiar with the data, they have access. We don't. We don't look at it. We don't know what's inside it. But when you look at the companies that are implementing AI-based applications, and there were a lot of studies on this topic in terms of adoption, one thing that is important, you have to separate pre-COVID and post-COVID. Pre-COVID, the adoption of AI-based solution was sputtering, in the sense that AI was a big, exciting candy that everyone must have. And then when you look at the practical application of it, there was not a lot of successes. COVID happened and suddenly everything changed. Why? Because now people are on the cloud, and people that are not on the cloud are going to die. They are going to have, there is studies that have shown that companies have gone from 5 years plan of doing basically digital transformation to months of digital transformation, because you have no choice. I know government department that went overnight, like Friday, they decided to do it, on Monday, 99%, and this is government. So everybody understand that in order to survive post during the COVID situation, you have to go to full digital transformation. Now, in between these two times, pre-COVID and while we're into the COVID, the problem that we ignored as a society, we are very concerned about the individuals, the privacy, and we worry about that justifiably. But when you look at organizations and companies, putting the right procedure and the right governance has not been done whatsoever. As a matter of fact, what has happened before, the CEO and the board of directors heard about AI and they will tell their CTO, I need to see some AI in the company. We have to. We heard about this exciting technology. Show me that we're going to do that. So it was not a lot of thought put into it. And there is many factors. You know, the data privacy is one, but there's also the fact that digital transformation, if you don't have access to the data, it's in many data lake or swamps, right? You can be a company that have data swamp as opposed to data lake. So garbage in, garbage out. That's another aspect, access to the clean data. The third thing is trained people in analytics that understand what's going on in AI. So when the reason that it was sputtering pre-COVID is because there was not a lot of thought put from top to bottom across the whole organization. If you want to make a successful implementation of an AI-based application, it follows the same process as any other technology adoption. And you know the technology curve. You start with high expectation, you go through a lot of headaches, difficulties, then you go potentially into the valley of death, where you basically say, I cannot do it, it doesn't make sense. People that persevere and they go through the valley of death, or just before they get into the valley of death, start to see, oh, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and finally, wow, how can we have done without it? Now, what does it take to get there? It takes a whole organization, starting from the board of directors, and the CEO, and they need somebody from a governance perspective to ensure that the number one, the positive aspect of AI are adhered to. We don't end up with AI for bad. We end up, for example, we don't want to utilize face recognition to screen people out that are unfairly screened, if it's by gender. If you're applying for loans, you don't want to be, again, biased on things like your past, just because of your color of your skin, you are not going to be receiving this kind of loan, and so on. So we want to ensure that there are governance in the company that is set. For example, MindBridge was the first company that signed the Montreal Declaration, to be responsible AI. We want to make sure that companies are registering for responsible AI and are implementing the guardrails within the company to avoid using AI for anything except as positive and AI for good.
You know, I'm really glad you stressed the data bias attribution, because that's one of the vulnerabilities in often data sets for different use cases. And, you know, I just finished writing a couple of blogs on the Forbes channel, one that was talking about the risks of data bias, and just launched this morning a very detailed review on explainable AI. One of the things that I've been observing, and many others, is that the board of director certification programs, they really have to accelerate their curriculum content. There's no question your point of view that all levels of an organization need to understand. One of the questions that I always ask, Eli, is where are your AI algos? Where are they? And do you know the math that's under them? Kathy O'Neill has been a proponent of math destruction and the need to drive integrity reviews in the actual algos. Really appreciate your perspectives there. Let's move to a little bit of a different angle. One of the things that I'm always intrigued by with your profile in particular, Eli, is that you've been a serial entrepreneur. And one of the valuable aspects of the program that we're doing, profiling incredible leaders, I like to say, is in terms of sharing the stories of what did you study in school. Is like when you were a young lad, about say 7, 6 years old, were you, a math, science geek? Did you like all subjects? What did you pursue? And in your high school aptitude, what did you do in university? And how did, if you think about the journey over the milestones, now you're in one of the most innovative fields that's bursting through the seams, high growth rates. It's not like that it was totally new. We went through a nuclear winter in the 80s, but now we've got the processing power. So a lot of these ideas, we can actually make happen. We just don't have necessarily all the guardrails. But I'd just love to hear your personal journey story along the way. So entertain me more.
You know that they say that one of the most important characteristic of a person that is successful is the curiosity. They said if you want to hire great individual to your company, find out the curiosity factor. And if you have this high curiosity quotient, this individual will be very successful. I remember being 4 or 5 year old and driving my parents crazy, asking why is this, why, the curiosity. And this is something that go back to my childhood. And I remember growing and dreaming about Canada. And I spoke in my TED talk about looking at Canada and looking at the big blue lakes and the vast green of the trees and so on. I always want to say, if you look at the vastness, what else is there in the universe that is vast like that? And this is what always intrigued me. Like, how can you do more? How can you go beyond what you see in front of you? Ask, why is it done that way? Why is it blue? Why is it green? Why is it done in this fashion? And that's really what pushed me always. If you look at my career, I always looked in the next generation of what it was. If it was telecommunication, it was photonics. If it was the computer, if it was internet, I always looked at the next thing, what is going to happen, what will take place. As Wayne Gretzky always said, don't look at where the puck is. Wayne Gretzky goes where the puck is going to be, right? And this is really, when you look at it, when I jumped into the AI, this is where the next wave is going to be. And that's why I felt that it's unlimited potential, and I wanted to be part of that.
I'm really glad you stressed the point on curiosity, because the curiosity is the underlying quotient for building elasticity and trust, for innovation, capacity, and resilience. So thank you for sharing the story on curiosity. What about, in terms of as you went through the journey, obviously curious, what did you study? Did you do an engineering degree, a math degree, a business degree, a arts degree, a psychology degree? Just curious, what you studied as the base, and then how you evolved.
I studied engineering degrees, and I did my master's in software product management, in terms of how to build bigger computer systems utilizing microprocessors. And that was my thesis. Actually, it was an extremely successful thesis. I had 4 papers published with that. So this is kind of what my always interest again is bigger. What can you do bigger and faster?
We certainly like faster. In terms of as you went through sort of those learning journeys, what might be 3 key messages that you can share with all citizens in terms as they look at the next? So obviously Bernard Marr just finished his new book that just came out called "We're Moving into the All Intelligence Revolution," where the basic premise is AI is in everything that we have in life. Yet there are many individuals that aren't familiar with even this concept. Like Estonia just finished releasing an educational program for all citizens to be aware and to understand the importance of data, understand that where their data is going, and how it's being used, to really bring that foresight to bear. Also to get involved to ensure that there is explainable AI, that they have an opportunity and a responsibility to sort of build a more intelligent world. But what are 3 messages you'd like everybody to hear that you think are the most significant to sort of accelerate your perspective on responsible AI?
I would like to separate between an individual and a company. So let's start with the individuals. In terms of individuals, I think it's very important that, number one, don't be afraid of AI. Clearly, anytime that you have a technology or something that is unknown, there is apprehension about using it. So when you look at AI, make sure that if you're going to buy into that, you are going to make sure that there is explainable AI, that it's not a black box, but rather it is a glass box. And you want to make sure that it is responsible AI. Now, the second point is that you have to be careful about your own data. Right now, we, as in the Western world, have given away all of our data, probably with the exception of healthcare, and I don't know even about that, into the hands of few organizations. And you know what happens? That this information can leak and can be exploited. So point number two, make sure that your privacy setting on your social media is there, so you are not going to be exposed to certain situation. Why? Because the data is the fuel to the AI. And if your personal data, yes, by itself, it's not valuable, but when it's added up in terms of the million of people, it becomes valuable. So be very careful about your financial and your personal and your healthcare information. And the last piece is adopt AI at the pace that you can feel comfortable. You don't have to be bullied into it if you are not ready. And by the way, it's already in every walks in our life. If you use Alexa, if you use Siri, if you use Google, you are already utilizing many products that have AI in them. And it's up to you, by setting up the right privacy setting on your social media, to determine and be careful about how much are you willing to share with your data. So that's one thing that you have to know and you have to be aware of. Obviously, Google know what your searches are, Amazon know what you buy, and Facebook knows what who your friends are and what they like. So we already done that. It kind of, you cannot, the train left the station in from that perspective. But into the future, you have to be careful. That's for the individual. These are the three really a golden rule that I will say for the individual. Companies, it's the other end of the spectrum. For companies, it's do or die, because we have a saying in MindBridge. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned, we are in a really good company because we were selected by the World Economic Forum as one of the technology pioneers. And this is really a great honor that is very difficult to, you don't apply for it. This is, you get selected, and we're a good company like Twitter and Google. So it's very exciting for us. But for companies, our saying is auditors will not be replaced by AIs. Auditors that don't use AI will be replaced by auditors that use AI. So AI is a horizontal technology. It's going to help companies to do a better job, because in today's environment, when we're dealing with the big data, we're just unable. If we're dealing with millions and hundreds of millions of transactions, a human being cannot manage it. You need the AI to help you make sense out of this data, or what we call it the MRI of data. What's hidden in your data, find out what's inside your data. So as a company, as opposed to the saying, we be very, very careful, you always are careful. But we talked about it, have the governance in the company, make sure that you have the right guardrail from a governance perspective. But if you use it as a tool, then it's basically like any other tool to help you do your job better. Because if you don't, from a competitive perspective, you are going to be disadvantaged. And there is no question that any profession that has a single or less than 5 elements in the activity that they do are going to be susceptible to being replaced, or some of their work replaced by AI. If you are a receptionist, that's it. So it's a single or 2, 3 tasks that's going to disappear. If you're an assembly line, we know already. If it's a cashier, we know already what's happening in this market because of AI. So from a company perspective, I think you have to set up the guardrail, but you have to run fast once you set up the guardrails.
Yeah, it's I just kind of want to try and attempt to summarize all the good points. I think there's one key message that everybody needs to leave with, and that is understand where your data is, both personally and from a company point of view, and where are the parameters and the risks and the nature of the data types. That's one of the things that we constantly see is people don't have their arms around where is my data and what are the risks and the impacts. And obviously, in order to apply AI, as you mentioned, that's the fuel that gets the engine moving. And so probably one of the most significant imperatives is for data literacy and to understand how data can be used for good or not for good. I loved your analogy of the data swamp versus the data lake, because in many companies, they're still in the data swamp. They've got data that's isolated, things aren't centralized, they're not operating all in the cloud, so they actually have the full enablement to then easily build the models, right? So we could end up in a situation, in many companies we are, where they're building AI models, but they're distributed, that the knowledge and the history and the methods and maybe even the review practices, they're not normalized. So, those are, I think that's one additional key takeaway. I loved your fact about the do or die and the speed and the imperative and the reality of this isn't going away. This is well underway. One of the books I finished reading was on the superpowers, between China and its incredible declaration to be absolutely AI dominant. The US has got their AI declaration position very clearly marked. They just released in early August, the US Department of Commerce, a very clear position on explainable AI. So they're really working hard to get I'd call it the fuel, so that the various regulatory bodies can start creating the audit tenets to sort of look in and validate, because we do know audits will be coming, especially in high risk situations. It's not going to be for all situations, but anywhere where there's higher business risks, there will be maybe even validation of machine learning, with a formal accreditation like we have with CAs. There's a lot of discussion of that going on, particularly in the various regulatory bodies now. That does this need to be a regulated professional practice, just like people had to, you think about data being the most strategic asset worldwide, then do we need more formal certifications? So with that, I'm going to close out. Are there any last comments you'd like to have for our audience today that you want to close with, Eli? I mean, you're doing some really exciting things, and congratulations for the World Economic Forum, accolades, because you know what, that is, I hope that should be a national coverage news. I mean, how many other Canadian companies in AI have ever been mentioned in that area? So just, well, kudos to you and your team.
Thank you. There were 6 of us this year, so very proud to be part of a select group. But I think that it's really important not to be scared of AI, but also be cognizant that there is a segment of, like anything, you have the majority of people are doing things for good, but you cannot ignore things like deep fake and others that are potentially could hurt individual, and it is up to companies that are developing it to find the mechanism to block these kind of bad actors that are really giving bad name. But this isn't everything else. But don't be scared about using it. It is a tool that is very useful. We know in medicine how helpful it is. We know in many walks of industry that it is a very useful tool that can help a lot. And if we're going to use it properly, like anything else, will benefit. Humanity will benefit, and we should not be scared of it.
Thank you very much, Eli, for joining us today in our Advanced Analytics and AI series. really appreciate your comments and your perspectives. And again, congratulations for all the successes that you and your leadership team have had at MindBridge. Thank you very much.
It's an honor to be on your show, Cindy.